Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika-prananatha padasarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattatam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda pararavinda marupananya vinashujjitan purna prema rasotsavo jalamano vritti prasannananan. Shashvat Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudake Dato Vande Bhagavatam Iman Anulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Namah. Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanastrinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisam Janma Janmani Raga Bhajana Ghami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sadasmara Smarantem Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme. And Yaram Yan Kilaga Sangha Shamani Shrutratitim Sangatha Yasadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dikkarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hiraye Vrajanda Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakti Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So, by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acaryas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. So we're in the middle of our discussion of verse 32 in the text, Tṛṇād sunīcena, and we've discussed two of the four qualities in this verse, those of giving honor to others and not expecting it for oneself, or put another way, respectfulness and non-conceitedness. So now we'll discuss a third of the four qualities, that of being tolerant like a tree, or more tolerant than a tree. So this will go on for some time, and this will deal with the idea of tolerance specifically, as well as something general about all of these qualities and how they're acquired and how they fit together. So, without further ado, the third quality described in the verse under discussion is that of being more tolerant than even a tree. Taror api sahiṣṇunā. While all the editions of Padyavali used to prepare this commentary contain the word api after taror, numerous editions of Chaitanya Charitamrita, where the verse under discussion is also cited, have the word eva in place of api. A number of the Sanskrit commentaries on Chaitanya Charitamrita also have this variant. And, perhaps most importantly, the two Bengali explanations of the verse under discussion in Chaitanya Charitamrita itself also use the word sama, which is equivalent in meaning to the word iva, and do not use the word hoite or another word that is similar in meaning to the word api. It is thus likely that in the version of the verse originally used by Sri Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswamipad, the spelling was given as iva rather than api. In the case of this variant, the minor difference in meaning is that one is advised to be tolerant like a tree rather than tolerant more so than even a tree. So, not a big deal. If one can manage either one, that'll get them quite a long way. But these two variants are found, so I've stuck officially to the way it's given in the editions of Padyavali, but it appears that Kaviraj Goswami's explanation follows the other reading. In Chaitanya Charitamrita, Sri Kaviraj Goswamipad recounts Sriman Mahaprabhu's explanation of this quality of tolerance to Swarup Damodar and Rai Ramananda as follows. One practices tolerance like a tree in two ways. As a tree does not say anything when cut, does not beg for water from anyone when drying up and dying, and gives its own wealth to whomever asks for it. And two, as a tree tolerates heat and rain and protects others. Here, the differentiation of two ways in which a tree is tolerant is made by distinguishing between a tree's tolerating the hardships posed by other living entities and tolerating the hardships posed by the forces of nature. So we're familiar with what they call the treetop jala, or the tapatrayam, the three miseries of material existence, those caused by oneself, by others, and by what come from, daiva, call it the devas, call it your own destiny, call it the forces of nature, what have you. So taking category 2 and category 3, we can read this interpretation to refer to tolerance of two of these three forms of misery, which would imply, of course, also tolerating the third. A slightly more elaborated explanation of this quality of tolerance, as described in the verse under discussion, is also given by Sriman Mahaprabhu to Shuklambar Brahmachari elsewhere in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, a Vaishnava should practice tolerance like a tree and should not say anything to anyone when chastised or beaten. As a tree does not say anything when cut and when drying and dying, still does not beg for water, so a Vaishnava should not beg for anything from anyone, and rather accept only unsolicited subsistence or eat greens and fruits. One should always take the name and foster contentment in accord with attainment. That is, be content with whatever is encountered. This practice nourishes the quality of bhakti. The commentator on Padyavali also summarizes many of these qualities of a tree in his rendering of the phrase tolerant more so than even a tree as follows. Quote, Hari is to be praised always by one who is tolerant even more so than a tree, which tolerates any offense, even that of being cut down and so forth, and helps everyone with its own fruits, flowers, leaves, bark, roots, and so on. From these explanations, it can be understood that the quality of tolerance like a tree, described in the verse under discussion, actually entails a multitude of complementary qualities. The capacity to remain non-inimical, non-vengeful, non-rivalrous, and non-angered, that is, on the whole undisturbed, by offensive, inimical, aggressive, or selfishly motivated persons or other entities. The capacity to obtain or the capacity to not object or complain about the actions of such persons. The capacity to foster goodwill towards such persons and support them by providing them with protection and resources, at one's own expense as far as one is able. The capacity to sustain such behavior without making any concerted effort to bolster one's own means to continue to do so, or obtain some favor or reward in exchange for doing so. And the capacity to remain content within oneself all the while. While it goes without saying that all of these qualities that are entailed in being tolerant like a tree are exceptionally rare and difficult to practice, it is also crucially important to understand that they are based on other more fundamental qualities. And it is only by means of these fundamental qualities that these qualities entailed in being tolerant like a tree can be successfully acquired and practiced. Insight in this regard can be found in Bhagavan Sri Krishna's explanation of the qualities of a bhakta in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, which begins as follows. So just as a roadmap here, in verses 13 to 19, or even 20, the final verses of chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita, after describing how one should practice bhakti yoga, he then describes the qualities of a practitioner. And the overall gist of the whole discussion, as I'll just spoil it here, is that these qualities are acquired as a result of engaging in the practice. And how these qualities fit together, or how one enables the other, which ultimately can enable one to exhibit such an extremity of virtue as is entailed in what we've read so far about how a tree can be personally undisturbed and greatly supportive even of persons who are highly inimical towards it. How one reaches that state of mind, so to speak, and what are the prerequisites within one's attitude, within one's own conception of self, within one's own general conduct that can enable someone to actually behave in such an exalted manner. That is very nicely brought out in the commentaries on these verses in the Gita, specifically or principally in the commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti. So we'll see how he explains all the steps that are necessary to that type of behavior becoming possible. And ultimately, what are the practical steps that someone can do starting from perhaps at a stage that seems far below such exalted behavior, how one can realistically approach a standard of that behavior without it seeming like, one is a shameless sinner trying to act like a saint, so to speak, but can, modestly hold that as an ideal and aspire towards it within one's life. So that's overall where the conversation is going. So let's dive into it. I hope it's interesting. I find Chakravarti Pad's many of his points here very nice. So first of all, we'll look at the verse in the Gita where Krishna first explains the qualities of his bhakta. He says, quote, "My bhakta, one who is non-inimical, friendly, and indeed compassionate towards all beings, free from possessiveness, free from egotism, equal towards suffering and happiness, forbearing, ever contented, a yogi, self-restrained, of firm conviction, and of mind and intellect offered to me, is dear to me." Sri Baladev explains the first 5 qualities mentioned in this verse in his commentary as follows. Quote, "Non-inimical towards all beings, adveshta sarva bhutanam, means free from enmity even towards those who engage in enmity towards oneself. By virtue of thinking, prompted by the Supreme Lord according to my prarabdha karma, they are acting inimical towards me." So later on we'll get into other perspectives on this matter, but let's take note of the first perspective. If someone is treating me badly, just to put it simply, what should I think about that? Should I think this person is bad and I'm not, and they shouldn't be doing this, and I'm a victim, and I'm right and they're wrong? So you could think that way, but here he's suggesting that the mentality of a bhakta is that this behavior that's coming to me, I'll see it as caused by me, or rather by my prarabdha karma, by the fructifying or the actively fructifying results of my own past actions. Maybe past actions in a past life that I'm not aware of. Whatever the case may be, I'll see it as an outcome of my own past karma. So in that way, I'll accept responsibility for it. I won't see the person who's treating me inimically as the principal agent involved, but rather as simply delivering to me the consequence of my own previous action, or mirroring back to me the way I may have treated someone else in the past. So if someone can foster that attitude, then the outcome is that one is not inimical towards that person. Just as if, the postman delivers you a message that you don't like, you don't blame the postman. If, your app, through your app you get a message that is inimical, you don't blame the app for sending it to you. You understand that this is just a media by which it came to you. So similarly, even what in a legal sense might be the perpetrator of wrongs against you, a particular person, still one from a broader perspective can see that that person is more like an agent that's being engaged by Bhagavan himself to deliver to me my own prarabdha karma. So I don't need to be inimical towards that particular person. Rather, when I can free myself from that attitude of being inimical towards them, then how should I see them? One is also friendly, that is amiable towards them, thinking they are dwelling places of the Supreme Lord. So look at this. This immediately rings a bell from our discussion of the quality of mānadena, or giving honor to others, which, as we discussed, was all principally based upon recognition of the presence of Bhagavan and one's Ishtadevata within the other person. So, by recognizing this other person to be a dwelling place of my Ishtadevata, and to recognize that this person is whatever action that this person, animated by my Ishtadevata within them, is performing, is an outcome of that my Ishtadevata's arrangement to deliver to me my own prarabdha karma, then not only should I not be inimical towards that person, but rather I can be friendly towards that person. I can see that this person is worthy of respect. Moreover, or furthermore, one is compassionate towards them, karuna, thinking, let them not undergo distress if they are distressed for some reason. For the most part, people hurt others because they're in a state of want or hurt, or they've been treated hurtfully and they don't know how to behave otherwise because that's the only way that they've been shown how to act. So, although it's difficult, people who are hurting us are usually the people that are most in need of being treated with kindness and being shown a way that's not hurtful to act instead, or rather to treat them with compassion. So when one can understand that this person is inherently honorable by virtue of the presence of my own Ishtadevata within them, when this person is being used as an agent to deliver to me my own prarabdha karma, and I can also understand that this person is been delegated this task of delivering to me my prarabdha karma because of some karma of their own as well, which is evidently not a pleasant state of karma to be undergoing, since treating other people treating others inimically implies the presence of dvesh within one's own mind, and whenever anyone's mind has dvesh within it, it's a polluted and unpleasant state. So seeing that this person is actually, so driven in this way, then I can see them as respectable, I can see them as a worthy object of compassion, I need not harbor any ill will towards them. One is, quote, and lastly, and what does it mean to be compassionate towards them? Compassion is defined as intolerance of another's suffering, or not wishing or wanting any suffering for another, even those who cause suffering to oneself. Then, the fourth quality, one is free from possessiveness in regard to the body and so on. That is, one is free from myness or mamata in relation to them, thinking these are transformations of prakriti and not mine. That is, they do not belong to me. One is free from egotism, nirahankara. That is, free from identification with these, the body and so on. Bhagavan Sri Krishna also mentions many of the qualities stated in this verse in a list of qualities possessed by sadhus, that is bhaktas, that he recounts to Uddhava in Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is the same list that also includes amāni and mānadena, as we discussed in the previous classes. There, like, quote, non-inimical towards all beings, adveshta sarvabhutanam, he states that a sadhu is, quote, non-malicious, akrita droha, meaning non-malicious towards any embodied being, including even those who are malicious towards oneself. He similarly states that a bhakta is friendly, meaning non-deceptive or avanchaka. So to be a friend is to not treat the person whom you've befriended deceptively or deceitfully in any way. And supportive of all, sarvopakara, equipoised, sama, resolute, dritiman, meaning not wretched, that is not miserable, misbehaved, or undiscriminating even in the midst of adversity, and, quote, forbearing towards all embodied beings, meaning tolerant of offenses from all beings, the high, middle, and low, including even those disrespectful towards oneself. So I point out these parallels because the way Krishna describes a sadhu or a bhakta in the Bhagavatam more or less is directly parallel to the way he describes his bhakta in the Gita, in some cases with a little bit more detail. And I've just included, in the footnotes, all of these points are drawn out of the acaryas' commentaries on them to illustrate what specifically these qualities refer to. Sri Chakravarti Pad goes on to explain in his commentary on the aforesaid verses in Sri Gita how the qualities of freedom from possessiveness, nirmamata, and freedom from egotism, nirahankarata, are prerequisites for the aforementioned qualities of being non-inimical, friendly, compassionate, and so forth towards all beings. So here's where it gets interesting, or here's where we get into a gradation or a hierarchy of qualities. How you can only really be one way if you have a certain prerequisite quality already. So a question is raised, quote, well, by means of what sort of discernment shall friendliness and compassion even towards the inimical come about? So Chakravarti Pad is very practical here. Every quality that's brought up, he puts a very flat, realistic, or you could say down-to-earth kind of objection against it. So he's just coming straight on with common sense and saying, you're telling me to be non-inimical towards the people that are trying to hurt me, trying to, defame me or whatever. Why should I be like that? Why should I be friendly and compassionate to people who are inimical to me? No doubt, this question will arise in the minds of many. So in that regard, Bhagavan Sri Krishna says, those qualities of friendliness and compassion are fostered by my bhakta, verily without discernment. One is free from possessiveness and free from egotism. That is, because of an absence of possessiveness in regard to son, wife, and so on, and an absence of egotism in regard to the body. Enmity itself towards anyone on the part of my bhakta never fructifies. That is, never arises as a result of another's inimical behavior. So, why, furthermore, would discernment for the purpose of quelling the suffering produced by enmity towards oneself from another have to be accepted, that is, resorted to by my bhakta? It never would. This is the purport. So this is quite a, I might say, a pretty deep perspective. If truly someone doesn't have identification with the body or doesn't have any of this, ahankar, and doesn't have a sense of possessiveness over what is related to the body, then if someone comes along and threatens the body or what belongs to oneself, one doesn't become disturbed by it. Just as, you might see on the news, or you might come to know of something that was destroyed in some distant place. It doesn't particularly bother you. You're not particularly concerned because you don't have anything to do with it. You don't have any attachment to it. You don't have any relationship with it. So, like that, if you're not actually attached to the body, you're not actually attached to other things around you, then even if some threat arises towards them, then there isn't a cause of disturbance within the mind. So when there's no disturbance caused by that, then there's no need to apply some particular, analysis within one's mind in order to check oneself from acting animically. In other words, it's not that they have to try or force themselves to be non-inimical. Rather, because they're already free from attachment to the things that what someone who is conventionally considered inimical is threatening, they have no issue. They're just naturally non-inimical in the first place. Sri Chakravarti Pad's point here is that when a bhakta is free from possessiveness and egotism, then a bhakta doesn't feel threatened by inimical persons, because such a bhakta is not attached to persons or possessions that an inimical person could harm, or attached to prestige, honor, and the like that an inimical person could tarnish. Thus, a sense of reciprocal enmity towards an inimical person does not arise in the mind of a bhakta as a result of an inimical person's inimical behavior. And thus, such a bhakta does not need to engage in any form of deliberation as a means of mitigating the presence of enmity in their mind resulting from that inimical behavior, so that they can foster an attitude of friendliness and compassion towards the inimical person. Rather, a bhakta simply retains an attitude of friendliness and compassion towards inimical persons from the beginning to end, by regarding them as instruments prompted by Sri Bhagavan to deliver the results of their own karma in accord with the fundamental view that all beings are dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan, as was stated by Sri Vidyabhushan Pad above in regard to how a bhakta fosters a friendly disposition towards all, and as was explained in the aforementioned explanation of Sriman Mahaprabhu in regard to the quality of honoring others in the verse under discussion. So here you can see that honoring others and not being conceited or being free from egotism are fundamentally essential to this quality of tolerance. You're not going to genuinely or actually be tolerant of the other so long as you have this, pre-existent egotism, which is going to inhibit you from genuinely remaining free from enmity and genuinely treating the other with friendliness and compassion. So in that sense, the amāninā is, as Sanatana Gosvami said, and this also directly illuminates the point made by Sanatana Gosvami, that nirahankarata, or amāninā, is fundamental to every other good quality, or every virtue that someone can have is predicated upon the extent to which they are free from conceit, or free from egotism. So, what this illuminates is that the idea here of tolerance is not like a willpower test or like a tapasya to, grit out some harsh circumstances while one is, holding the tension or the fire back, so to speak, but rather that by virtue of knowledge and by virtue of, the further points that will be discussed ahead, one has a fundamental attitude that precludes these various, tensions or threats or perpetual uncertainties that we live with in this place called the world from causing these tendencies for inimical attitudes and so forth to arise in the first place. So, in other words, the extent to which one can engage in these spiritual practice profoundly pays off in the daily unfolding of life, and can enrich the quality of one's life profoundly if one can actually acquire some of this purity of mind and this absence of egotism, attachment, and so forth, how much peace and warmth and goodness one will, sustainingly or consistently feel, even in the midst of all the turbulence of worldly existence. That's, not that one is following this path just to find simple peace and happiness, but nevertheless, as a byproduct, that will come to you in abundance. Okay, moving on. Sri Chakravarti Pad goes on to discuss an important practical objection that very likely arises in the mind of most in regard to the idea of simply treating the inimical with friendliness and compassion. And his resolution of this objection shows the importance of the qualities stated in the verse after that of freedom from egotism, namely those of being equal towards happiness and suffering and being forbearing, that is, tolerant. So here he objects now to what was just said. Well, still some suffering in the body and so forth, as a result of blows and so on delivered by others with feet and fists will certainly occur. Sorry, this is all passive voice, literal translation. In other words, if you just act all nice to someone who's inimical to you, he's just going to come and beat you up and take advantage of you. Just to put it bluntly, if someone fosters an attitude of only friendliness and compassion towards inimical persons and thus allows oneself to be attacked by them. So that's a fair objection. And, there's many people out there who've been, mugged or physically attacked. It's not unreal. It's a very common thing in the world. To that he says, where did my text go? Okay, here it is. To that he says, equal towards suffering and happiness, sama dukkha sukha, as is described by Bhagavan Shiva in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, all who are devoted to Narayan do not become afraid under any circumstances. They are seers of the same object amid svarga, liberation, and even naraka. Equality towards happiness and suffering means being a seer of equality in regard to them. That, furthermore, is based on the attitude, quote, this is a result of my prarabdha karma. It must be endured by me. Even in the midst of that equality, suffering is endured verily with tolerance. Thus he says, forbearing, kshami, that is, a bhakta acceptingly tolerates whatever their prarabdha karma allocates. So, just as the tree tolerates and nourishes those who come to it, even if they come to chop it down or whatever, and the tree also feels the pain of being cut up, so similarly, in the course of being non-inimical and friendly and compassionate, even to inimical people, they may still hurt you. They may still take advantage of you. They may still do things that cause suffering or cause misery to you. So he's saying that therefore one has to bear that. One has to be forbearing in the midst of that, and one can do so by perceiving that as the outcome of one's own prarabdha. Or one can see that this happening and suffering that I'm going through, it's not just caused by this person, it's fundamentally caused by my own karma. So rather than adopting a grand deterrent strategy to preclude it from happening by virtue of my present action, rather, not that one doesn't need to do, doesn't need to have street smarts or common sense, doesn't mean you have to just leave your car unlocked in a ghetto or something like that. It's not saying to be, stupid, but nevertheless that using basic due diligence outside the scope of that, what comes to me by my prarabdha karma, I'll have to forbear that, and I don't need to foster any inimical attitude towards those who deliver that to me, Rather, I can see it from an equipoised perspective or an equanimous perspective by seeing it all as an unfolding of the dictation of my own karma. So that's not easy. In other words, to sustain that attitude as well as to actually forbear the difficulties of life, that's not necessarily easy by any circumstance, by any measure of the imagination, and depending on the severity of one's karma, it may be very difficult. But nevertheless, Krishna is saying that his bhakta is that. His bhakta is someone who has the strength of character, the strength of heart to forbear in the midst of what they encounter. Here, the point is that a bhakta will see whatever adversity they undergo, by means of the actions of inimical persons, to be the outcome of their own past karma. And they will acceptingly tolerate that adversity, as a tree tolerates heat, cold, wind, rain, dehydration, physical mutilation, and so forth. Meaning, they will tolerate that without becoming inimical, vengeful, or otherwise unfavorably disposed towards those persons who are simply instruments in the delivery of their own karma. Rather, as Sri Jiva explained in regard to a teaching of Bhagavan Kapila discussed earlier, by virtue of their equal vision, or samadarshana, a bhakta will foster goodwill towards such persons, by virtue of their vision of them as dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan. So, quote, one of equal vision, samadarshana, means one who wishes the well-being of others, just like oneself, on account of the equality of oneself and others in being dwelling places of Bhagavan. So here again, the perspective that was fundamental to the quality of honoring others is here also being shown to be completely essential to successfully tolerating the behavior of others, or tolerating what one encounters in life. And that to tolerate it like a tree is to tolerate it without, as well as to foster goodwill and kindness towards the perpetrator or towards the cause of the difficulty that one is tolerating. And how can one do that? How can one wish well even for what, by conventional analysis, people say, oh, this guy's a jerk, this guy's a lowlife, this guy's a bad person, or whatever people tend to label and assume to be the mentality of those who they don't like or those who hurt them. So rather than resorting to that type of superficial judgment, to say, this person, I can, as I wish well for myself, so too I can wish well for that person. Because just as I am, have a sense of self-worth and have a sense of pursuit of fulfillment in life by virtue of being an entity that is part of Bhagavan's reality, that is a place in which Bhagavan dwells, so too is that person. So everything that I'm entitled to and aspire to, so too does that entity. Everyone has the same fundamental needs, the same fundamental, eligibility, so to speak. So just as I would want good for myself, so too I can want good for the other, because my wanting of good for anything is all ultimately tied back to that central, all-pervading thread of the Advaya Gyan Tattva, namely Bhagavan. In other words, to sustain this fundamental teaching of the Shastra of samukyata, or awareness, ever-intentness upon Bhagavan, even my own sense of being, my own sense of value, my own sense of worth, respectability, of having meaning and pursuit in life, all of that is ultimately riding on the sense that I belong to Bhagavan, I am a part of Bhagavan, I am a servant of Bhagavan. That gives me inherent self-worth, that gives me inherent meaning and purpose in life. And just as I have that, so too does every other jiva. So just as I foster those things towards myself, so too I can foster them towards every other jiva. Whatever may be the present conditioning of their psyche and the outcome of that in the form of their behavior, as undesirable as it may be on a given day. From this statement, it can be understood that just as honoring others should be practiced based on vision of Sri Bhagavan's presence within all beings, so too being tolerant like a tree, as described in the verse under discussion, is also meant to be practiced on the basis of such awareness, or samukhya of Sri Bhagavan within all beings. Sri Samipad also comments on the aforesaid verse of Sri Gita that the quality of being, quote, equal towards happiness and suffering refers to regarding one's own suffering and happiness as equal with that of others, meaning feeling the suffering and happiness of others as one's own by virtue of being compassionate towards them, that is, by virtue of being unable to tolerate that they suffer. So he's glossing the idea of compassion as an intolerance for the suffering of another. As I explained, this is a classical way that in Sanskrit texts the idea of compassion is given. So what's here, you could perhaps also use the more modern term empathy to describe it. So to say that equal towards happiness and suffering means equal towards my happiness and suffering and the happiness and suffering of another. In other words, to understand that as I would feel pain if I were, subjected to excessive exposure to fire or water or air or, the elements in various combinations, so too would another. So to not treat another without reference to the outcome of that treatment upon them, or to bear in mind and to care for the outcome of the treatment upon them, just as I care for it upon myself, this is the fundamental basis of all virtue, or of all human dignity and human relations. What they call the golden rule in the Bible, which is also found in the Mahabharata, that the universal principle of dharma is to treat others as one would expect or want to be treated, and to not treat others the way one wouldn't want to be treated oneself. And of course, there is an exception to that insofar as you might refrain from treating someone else in a way that you wouldn't treat yourself, but if you know that that's something that maybe doesn't bother you but does bother them, that doesn't give you an excuse to do it. In other words, that rule applies up to the extent that you're not specifically aware of or attuned to the sensitivity of the other, but it's not meant to be limited to that. In other words, the whole point of the principle is that you attune to how the outcome of actions has its effect upon the other, and you factor that in, or you care about that in how you act in relation to them. So he's defining Samipad, interestingly, is taking this quality of samadukha sukha, or considering the suffering and happiness of another's like one's own, as this idea of seeing that, or bearing in mind or factoring in the equality of the outcome of actions upon oneself as they are upon others, which funnily means simply to care. Sri Chakravarti Pad offers a similar explanation elsewhere of the quality of equal vision, or samadarshana, in regard to the aforementioned teaching of Bhagavan Kapila. Quote, one of equal vision means one who sees happiness, unhappiness, and so forth everywhere, that is, in all beings, as equal to one's own. As stated by Bhagavan in the Gita, O Arjuna, be it happiness or unhappiness, one who sees everywhere in comparison to one's own self is considered the best yogi. So, in other words, to not act with only reference to how the outcome of one's actions causes oneself to feel, to act only with reference to that is to be, reckless, arrogant, harsh, insensitive, etc. And to act with reference to both how one's behavior affects oneself as well as how it affects those who are also subject to it, to take care about its outcome towards all that it affects, is the premise of good behavior, or of honorable behavior, and requires then that, on a mental level, the sensitivity to the feeling, or the sensitivity to the sensitivities of the other. In summary, to see both oneself and others equally pervaded by the presence of Sri Bhagavan, and to foster empathy for others based on goodwill and compassion for them, is integral to the equanimity that is exemplified by the tolerance of a tree mentioned in the verse under discussion. So in other words, this idea of being tolerant like a tree necessitates this. It's not just like a stoic, stand there and bear it idea. The whole idea, as it's explained, is to, have sensitivity towards those who are approaching oneself, and to respond to them, however they treat you, to respond to them with sensitivity to how one's actions are towards them, and to foster goodwill, compassion, see to the welfare of the other. Thus it is said, even in a condition of receiving harm, the virtuous help those who harm them. Does a tree, even while being chopped down, not offer protection to those who are cutting it with its own shade? So this is how the quality of the tree is being perceived. The tree is giving shade, giving support, even to the person who's treating it inimically or trying to kill it. And it's not becoming an enemy of that person, rather it's continuing to bear goodwill and support to the other. This analysis also shows that the two qualities discussed earlier in the verse under discussion, namely amāninā, that is, being free from conceit related to the body and so on, and free from desire for honor, and two, mānadena, that is, giving honor to all beings by virtue of their being dwelling places of Sri Bhagavan, are thus the conceptual foundation of the quality of being tolerant like a tree. Thus, without freedom from conceit and vision of Sri Bhagavan's all-pervading presence within all beings, any attempt at such tolerance will be constrained by egotistical limitations and likely result in burnout or the practice of taking on a self-interested slant. In other words, one may continue to be tolerant, but in a calculative way, thinking that in the context of the relationship, one will later derive such and such benefit by tolerating whatever is happening in the present, or one will try to tolerate it, and then when it gets too much, then they just give up, or then they turn harsh, or whatever. So all of these difficulties that go on in relationships, they all arise to the extent that there's the presence of this fundamental egotistical orientation towards the relationship. So when there is that awareness of Bhagavan, when there is that absence of egotism, then it's possible for these qualities to really be sustained and to really flourish and be expressed in a genuine manner. Sri Samipad, as well as Sri Sanatana and Sri Jiva following him, thus describe a bhakta's quality of being compassionate, karunika, mentioned by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the verses of the 11th canto that I mentioned earlier, as that, as that of being motivated only out of compassion, and not rather out of greed for a seen object, meaning a worldly object that thought to be attained as a result of, or in exchange for, acting compassionately towards someone. So this is an interesting commentary. He says, Karunika, karunaya eva pravartamanu natu drushta lobhina. So what he's saying is that even compassion can be selfish. Someone can be supportive of the other, try to relieve the suffering of the other, empathetic and kind to the other, but because they want something back from that, because they want the person to then treat them in a way that they have a particular desire for, because they want the person to then do whatever it is they want them to do for them or whatever. So compassion is not necessarily selfless, it's not necessarily not self-interested. So what he's saying here is that a bhakta can be compassionate in a genuine way, or karunaya eva pravartamana. They can be actually motivated by compassion alone, and not compassion with a hook on it of what benefit I get back from being compassionate to the other. So unless one has that fundamental non-egotistical orientation, and that fundamental orientation of perspective wherein it's Bhagavan that one is ultimately relating with, it's Bhagavan that one is ultimately honoring and serving within the context of all relationships, without those pillars, if you will, supporting the thoughts going on given a particular manner, then even being kind, friendly, and compassionate is fundamentally self-interested and is usually short-lived or has a limited scope on it. But when one has these deeper fundamental spiritual perspectives in place, then it can be actual, you could say, open gauge, so to speak, or it can actually be a real act of compassion which isn't based on getting something in return from it, but based on honoring Bhagavan and therefore, fit to be continued ad infinitum. All right, well, I think I'll stop here for today. This discussion will go on for quite some time, and we'll go into further gradation, all in this same Gita verse. We've gotten through about 5 qualities that are mentioned in this verse, and there's, 9 or 10 in the verse. So Chakravarti Pad will also object to what's being said so far, and then explain why further qualities are also requisite, and then object to those. And we'll also look at parallel points made about some of those qualities elsewhere in the Bhagavatam, similar to the manner that we've gone through so far. So these are all, sober topics which pervade all the practicality of life, so maybe not too much to bite off in one go here, and important food for thought and content for reflection and integration into our daily life. So I'll stop here. If anyone has any comments, questions, or anything else, please feel free to share.
Are you open to some discussion or some kind of question?
Sure.
I'm in the walk. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello. Okay, good. So, yeah, I was just reflecting a little bit on the whole analysis. It sounds like you're very high. In summary, you get the impression that its demand for humility is so high, almost impossible. Like you have to check all your intentions, even if you're trying to be humble towards others, that it's not fake or doesn't have any, reward attached to it. And I'm just thinking that perhaps one won't be able to conquer those unless one is blessed by sadhu-sangha. That is actually exemplifying that attitude and it's visible, tangible, so one can simply get that impression on the heart and mind, and also by the grace of sadhu-sangha, the actual humility will emerge. But then when I think this, I fall back to Guru Baba's lecture on he gave yesterday or the day before, where Narada is talking to Gopkumar, telling him that you need to follow, that's the process you need to follow. And he says, okay, but it's very hard to obtain the objective for what you want to obtain, is the bhakti. And he says, well, at least with your, if, of course, I may not be able to, but with your grace, with your affection, with your blessings, wouldn't I attain that? Right? It's for sure, I will. And they say, not really. It's so hard that even our blessings won't do. And of course, there's tika of Sanatana elaborating that actually is to test him. So, the test of Kumar, his eagerness. But, so what's the real picture? Is this sadhu-sangha really working, or it's just You know, what's the point? What are our chances? Basically, it's the main thought I have.
I mean, sadhu sangha is yadricha. It comes independently of its own accord into someone's life, and it's, you know, the greatest treasure of anything that can be found to acquire the association of a great Mahatma who's steeped in this type of deep spiritual consciousness. So the more one is so blessed to get that, the better. But at the same time, how much will anyone get of that in a given lifetime? There's no guarantee, there's no entitlement, there's no certainty. So one nevertheless has to try with whatever one has. And, you know, certainly it's you know, to be prayed for. There's a beautiful prayer in one prayer I like very much in Stotra of Yamunacharya. He says, Sakrideva prapano yas tava smiti chayachate. No, that's a different verse. It's worth, one sec, let me pull it up, it's worth quoting.
Thank you.
Let me see here. It's, I haven't thought of it. Sakrid tvarakaravi lokanashaya trini kritanuttama bhukti muktibi mahatma bir mamma valokatam naya kshanepi yad virahuti dusaha. Where he's saying, he's speaking to Bhagavan, saying, please take me into the sight, or please allow me to be seen by these Mahatmas for whom mukti and all varieties of bhukti, even the best of them, are nothing more than grass. And whose separation is very difficult even for you, Bhagavan, to bear. In other words, those bhaktas that Bhagavan suffers in separation from, I want the association of those bhaktas.
I see.
So, like this, you know, to pray for sadhu sangha is certainly a worthy prayer. And no doubt, the impressions that come, the samskara from that come from that association are what Rupa Goswami calls ati bhagya, or the great fortune. So that's one side of the coin, if you will. The other side of the coin is that there's also many who've gotten a lot of sadhu sangha and not made the most of it. And whatever amount of it that one may have received, it's also incumbent upon one to make good use of the grace, the teaching, the favor, everything that one has received. And we're, so to speak, being watched. In other words, if we're blessed with some sadhu sangha and then we squander it, then, you know, will we be seen as a likely candidate to be given a whole bunch more? You know, in other words, we also have to prove our worthiness and, you know, make do or make good on as much as we've been given. Of course, to the extent that we're able, and no doubt at least in my case, childlike fallenness is also evident in the eyes of the great ones. So, you know, we don't necessarily want to say, oh, because I don't have enough sadhu sangha, I can't do this, so therefore it's not my fault, or therefore I give up, or therefore there's no point in trying, or, you know, we don't want to go, that's sort of too far off the other way, one side of the road, and the other side of the street is that, you know, as much as we're able and as much as we're fortunate, we very much treasure and aspire for that association and consider it the
Right.
most useful resource that we could have to go along the path.
Yeah, thank you. But also we hear of quality of sadhu sangha. Not every sadhu sangha is of the same quality. And just recent examples, maybe not recent, but you know, in this last 100 years, Pandit Baba, who has just maybe 5 disciples, and all of them were, I think, they were sadakas, as being told. Bhagavata Savaji also had that Shakti, to say that just could basically instruct people to follow, and then they became, of course, the people who came to them, they were sent by Bhagavan, something their journey, that's without question. But what I'm saying, that perhaps sadhusanga, quality of sadhusanga is also to be taken into consideration, right?
Of course.
Because there is general definition of who is sadhu, of what is sadhusanga, but there's also perhaps very specific what actually constitutes sadhusanga that actually brings the effect, actually, delivers what we're looking for back to Brahma.
Yeah, I mean, generally it should be someone who's of higher adhikar, not too much higher and not lacking enough higher. In other words,
Right.
someone who's too much higher, we don't even have the ability to associate with them, you know. But someone who's not much higher, then there isn't as much benefit. So we want the sweet spot, so to speak, where it's higher that it pulls us up, but not too high that we cause disturbance to the person, or we don't have the eligibility to even grasp what they're giving.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know.
So that's why Rupa Gosvami said sajatya siddhānta sadhusanga, kind of remedy or a prescription for sadhusanga. It has to be sajatya first of all, of the same kind, right? I'm not sure how Rupa Goswami explains this verse, sajatya siddhānta sadhusanga. Is there a tika on that? I'm sure there's.
Yeah, it's more or less a literal tika. I mean, it just glosses the words in a straightforward form. Sajatyashai snigde sadhusanga svatovare. So it should be association which is superior to oneself, and of sajatya asha. So the aspiration should be of the same type. So
what does it mean exactly? Can you elaborate on what does it mean the same type? Is that the sampradaya trait or specific parivar trait or a specific raga that one has to have with sadhusanga, with sadhu?
I think there's some consideration of that according to stage. In the ultimate sense, it means that the specific sthayi bhav that someone aspires to is of the same characteristic.
Oh.
And then even sub-considerations inside of that may also come into play for very advanced persons. But in a more loose sense, for persons of, not so much education or not so far into what the Goswamis have taught, then there are also more general interpretations that may be applicable to persons in a elementary stage of education, so to speak. In other words, the Gaudiya tradition is quite wide, there's a lot of diversity in it, so those who gravitate towards and who focus specifically upon the Goswami's teachings as the primary subject of emphasis and authority, that would be a significant grouping, if you will. And then inside of them, those who have come to the point of aspiring for a particular type of bhava bhakti, a particular type of, sadhaka seva and siddharup seva and association that's specifically nourishing to one's lobha or one's aspiration for the bhava and seva that one aspires to perform. This would be the general sense.
So is it possible that... Yeah, I'm sorry. So is it possible that someone may refine his sajat with sadhusanga? Is it correct? Like, he comes in touch with sadhusanga, he gets diksha, and then at the time of his journey, he refines it. He's being more specific in his pursuit, and maybe you get some other sadhusanga within the sajatya of one's guru, but getting more specific or unique flavor that he's looking for, or that awakens in him. Okay.
Yeah, specificity will emerge as one goes forward, for certain.
So sadhusanga is not like restricted to one's own guru exclusively. Of course, it's prominent. This is prominent, of course, there's no question. But it's not just sadhusanga. Doesn't mean just association with one's own guru. Would that mean that?
Depends on the situation. If someone takes shelter in a guru, gets whatever they need from the guru, and achieves success, then perfect. If for some reason, not all the requisites are available due to whatever the circumstances are, then additional association may be highly beneficial. Depends on the needs, upon the stage, upon all the specifics of a given circumstance. And perhaps we could also add that while one may also, as one goes on, become very specific in terms of what one aspires to and what one internally cultivates, that doesn't mean that one can't also appreciate general things from a wide variety of sources. In other words, one might also be charmed by the behavior of a child they see, or a person that they interacted with on the street. I mean, one can also appreciate virtues and appreciate good behavior or appreciate points made anywhere by anyone. It's not that one's putting on, by becoming specific, we want to put on blinders, so to speak. And the more one is attuned to what one is aspiring for, one can perceive and relate to that in so many sources, in so many perhaps indirect or subtle ways. So what is referred to in the case of that statement of Rupa Goswami refers to the principal source of association, where one is receiving instruction, where one is taking that instruction to direct practical enactment in one's life. One is putting shraddha into that. One is contemplating that seriously. He's talking about sadhusanga in that very specific sense, principally. But, more broadly, there's also room to appreciate things on, more general levels to, complement that in the natural course of life. All right, well, maybe we can cap it at that for today, and we'll dive in the future to further discussion of these qualities, and also pray to have the association of Vaishnavas with these qualities. Oh, I see another hand came up. Did you want to say something? Yes, no? I don't hear anything. Okay, if you want to say something, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll conclude.
No, I finished.
Yeah, I know. I think another person has a hand up. Okay, well, I don't hear anything, so we can bring it up next time if somehow we're not able to hear you today.